morning I'm going to be telling you the story of the birth of Jacob and Esau. And I really struggled with preparing this sermon. There is a lot more in this text than I think that we sometimes think, especially if you learned this story in Sunday school growing up. So there are Bibles scattered around the room. If there's not one in front of you, there's some on the bookshelves behind you. I'm going to encourage you to grab one and turn to page 17 because I'm going to be skipping through 3 different chapters this morning. Chapter 25, chapter 26, and chapter 27. So we're covering a lot of territory. The first thing I want to talk to you this morning is about 2 prayers. Last week we talked about the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. And if you remember, there were all of these concerns about where Isaac's wife would come from and how that was going to happen. Abraham really insisted that Isaac not leave the land of Canaan, but also that he should not marry a woman from Canaan. There was this great concern that he marry someone within their family system and that this woman be ready and willing to offer hospitality because they lived in a country full of people who were different than themselves. So we talked about that. We talked about God's covenant with the family of Abraham. And if you remember, there are 3 components to this blessing. One is that there would be many descendants. The other, that these descendants would live in the geographical land of Canaan. And the third is that these descendants would be a blessing to all peoples of the earth. So the covenant promise has not changed. We've skipped a generation. We're to Isaac and Rebekah. They are married now. And if you read through the text, we figure out that they've been married 20 years and they've had no children. So in response to that, Isaac is seeing that this covenant promise is at risk because it depends on their having children. So Isaac's response is to go to prayer. So the first thing that we see here this morning, there are 2 prayers in the beginning of this passage. Isaac prays to the Lord, and in the Hebrew, this prayer, the word for prayer has to do with like begging or entreating to avoid some disaster. Isaac is begging God to provide Rebekah with a child. Now, if you're familiar with the story, you remember Abraham had his own system of coming up with a child. Isaac goes to God first. We're told that the Lord answers his prayer, and Rebekah, who is now pregnant for the first time, is experiencing something within her womb that is unrecognizable. She is experiencing jostling, it says in the NIV. In the Hebrew, there's an attitude of violence here. Something is not right. Now, this is before there were ultrasound machines, and Rebekah had never been pregnant before. She didn't have anything to compare it to. But Rebekah's response is to inquire of the Lord what's happening to her. So what I want us to see here, there are 2 prayers. Isaac prays for her wife that she could have children. Rebekah experiences something unfamiliar, and her response is to inquire of the Lord. Now, before we go too fast, I want you to think about the time frame here. There's no temple. There are no priests. There are no prophets. So we don't know what it looks like exactly for Rebekah to inquire of the Lord. But we're told that she did, and we are told that God has a reply. So let's look at this reply in verse 23. It's a prediction. And God says to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. I want us to begin by seeing that Rebekah's getting more than she asked for. She went to God saying, something's happening in me, I don't know what it is. And then God gives her this prediction about the fate and destiny of these 2 children she's going to bear. And I want us to pause for a moment and to think about, what in the world would you do with this information? This is before your children are born, before you've started parenting, before any of that has occurred, and you are told the destiny of these children, that they are going to be separated from one another. They're going to be vying for power. One is going to be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So I just want you to kind of pause and think about that for a moment. And then I want to offer a caution before we get too far into this story, because a lot of times when we hear Bible stories, there's a temptation to try to read motivation into the actions of the various characters. And I guarantee you that happens in this story. We start assigning motivation to Isaac, to Rebekah, to Jacob, and Esau. And it's informed from the text, but I want to sort of slow motion make sure that we, as we move forward through it, that we are guided by the text itself and by our knowledge of the culture. So let's listen to what the text says. In verse 24 and 25, it tells us about the birth story. And this is something I think we do in our own culture. We tell these stories, especially if there's anything surprising or unusual about a birth. That's a story that gets rehearsed. And I'm wondering if in the life of this family, if this was a story they told over and over again to Jacob and Esau as they were growing up. But let's take a look at the story. We're told that when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys that she delivered, and the first to come out was red and covered in hair, and so they named him, they looked at him, and then they named him Esau, which in Hebrew means hairy. And then they gave him a nickname because his skin was also bright. I'm wondering if it was his skin or his hair, I'm not really sure, but there was something about him that was red, and so they also called him Edom, which means red. So poor Esau, from birth, is called hairy and red because that's what he looked like. Okay, after this, his brother came out with his hand grabbing a hold of Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Now, Jacob has a nice meaning in Hebrew, but it sounds very similar. So Yaakov, and then there is a word in Hebrew that means, I have to look at it, hakab, which means grabber, and it can also be used for cheater or stealer. It kind of has these different connotations. So Yaakov, and I remember I looked it up, but now I can't remember, but it's something like God is sovereign, something like that. It's a lovely name. But Hakab means grabber, and so from the time of his birth, he's kind of given this nickname to remind him that he is a grabber. He is someone who is grasping for things. And in the moment, he's grabbing his older brother's heel. So these are the names that they're assigned. I'm imagining that at least on their birthday, mom and dad repeat this story of their birth because it was funny and it was interesting. You came out grabbing your brother's heel, and you came out and you were hairy, so we named you Hairy. Like they're telling them the meaning of their names. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah had these twins. Okay, so you kind of have a sense of the landscape here. This is all we've been told so far. Rebekah is given this prediction about the fate of her children, and their birth seems to reflect the early stages of this, and the names that are chosen for the children are also sort of filling in some of the thoughts about this birth. So now, I'm going to go through parts of the next 3 chapters. So I wanted to move through that first section pretty quickly because I want to make sure that we have time for chapter 25, 26, and 27. I mean, come on, we're here, let's do it. So I feel like sometimes we take these stories in small little bits, and that gives us the opportunity to miss out on some of the larger parts that are being told to us. And I told you last week, I asked you, who do we credit with gathering the stories of Genesis? Who's the person that we think of as the author of Genesis? Who gathered those stories? I think Ethan shouted it out. Moses. Moses is that guy. And what do we remember about Moses? What's his big story? What's the big thing that Moses did? The Exodus. Yes, he led the people out of Exodus back to the promised land. Okay, where all of this is taking place. This matters. So I want us, as we're moving forward through this story, to keep that in mind, that Moses is the one telling this story about the history of Jacob, Yaakov, who is the father of the Israelite nation. Okay, so he's telling their origin story. This matters. And so far what they know is that their ancestor is a grabber. He's a grabber. He's trying to grab for things that aren't his. Okay. We're told in verses 25 through 34 that these boys grew up, and the first thing is that Jacob stole Esau's birthright. So you probably learned this story in Sunday school. If not, I'll give us the Cliff Notes. We're told that Esau loves hunting in the open country of Canaan. I think that the author is telling us something here. That Esau is comfortable running through the open, wild land of Canaan, while Jacob, we're told in contrast, was content to stay home among the tents. Now, there's some argument by commentators about this word content in Hebrew because it can also mean upright or whole. It can have connotations of someone who is righteous, but we don't know what to do with that here, so they use the word content, which it can also mean. So Jacob is content to stay among the tents, but I think it's important that you know that there's at least the possibility that this could also signal some sort of righteousness, that his choosing to stay home may connotate this idea of righteousness. We're told that Isaac, the father, has a taste for the wild game that Esau gets when he goes out into the wild country. And we're told that Rebekah loves Jacob. Okay. Esau, on this one occasion, came home starving. He said he was famished. He said he was about to die. Meanwhile, Jacob is cooking some stew or some soup. It's red, which the author loves the play on words here between Edom, the red, hairy red guy, and the red stew that Jacob's making. I don't know if it matters, but there it is. Jacob is making this stew, and Jacob says, I will give you some of this in exchange for your birthright. Now, this is not okay for Jacob to ask. It's not okay to ask for the birthright, but he does. And Esau says, I'm about to die. What good is a birthright to me? It's also not okay for Esau to not care about his birthright. This is something he was born with. It's important in this culture. Okay, so we're seeing some failings here on both of their parts, perhaps. But then Esau swore an oath giving Jacob his birthright, and we're supposed to take from this story this idea that Jacob is a schemer, a grasper, and a cheater, and he's looking for his first opportunity to steal this birthright from his brother. But we're also told, this is the last sentence in this story, that Esau despised his birthright. So again, I'm slowing things down. We're getting signals here about the character of each of these individuals. But now this raises all kinds of questions. Why did Isaac love Esau, his hunting and wild game from the open land of Canaan? Why did Rebekah prefer Jacob? And what does any of this have to do with God's predictions about their future? Is this a cause or is it an effect? And I don't have the answer. I'm just posing the questions. But I wondered that about Rebekah, if perhaps the reason she loved Jacob is because she knew that God was going to use him to be the leader and that his older brother would be the one who served his younger brother. I don't know. I'm just posing the questions. So then the next chapter is Genesis 26. And this chapter comes out of nowhere. It doesn't fit the chronology. It doesn't fit the timeline. It doesn't make any sense why it's there. And the author of Genesis does this more than once in the book of Genesis, where it interrupts the storyline to tell us a backstory. And that's what Genesis 26 is. So trust me, I spent this week reading countless commentaries on Genesis 26, trying to understand what in the world this story was doing there. I'm going to summarize it for you, and then maybe we'll make sense of it together. In Genesis 26, we're told there's a famine in the land, and Isaac moves in the direction of Egypt. He takes Rebekah, and from as far as we can tell, this is before the boys were even born. So Isaac and Rebekah are moving in the direction of Egypt because there's famine in their own land, and then God says to him, do not leave the land. Don't go to Egypt. Instead, you need to stay in the land of Canaan. That's been God's word all along. Stay in the land of Canaan. So they end up in this Philistine kingdom that's sort of on the border between Canaan and Egypt. And when they move there, Isaac tells his wife, Rebekah, to pretend that she's his sister. This is not a new concept in Genesis. His father has already done this twice to his wife Sarah, right? When moving into different lands, being afraid that the people would kill you because your wife's so beautiful. So the plan is just pretend you're my sister and everything will be fine. So this is what Isaac does to Rebekah, and she goes along with it. Now God has just repeated to Isaac his blessing, the plan, the covenant blessing that's supposed to be over this family, which is to give descendants, land, and that they would be a blessing to all people. So they're moving into this Philistine area, this Philistine kingdom. Rebekah's pretending she's his sister so the Philistines won't kill Isaac. But then the Philistine king figures out that Isaac is actually married to Rebekah. He figures it out. And so he says, he kind of argues with Isaac, like, why did you put us all at risk in this way? This was a dangerous game to be playing. And he says, but I will tell all of the surrounding peoples to leave you alone, to protect you. And so Isaac prospers like crazy. He plants fields, and the fields produce like crazy. So Isaac is growing wealthy in the land of the Philistines. The Philistines are getting jealous. The king has promised protection. And so they say to Isaac, you need to leave. You can't be here. I can't protect you because all these people are jealous of the great resources you're developing. You need to leave. So Isaac goes out into the valley and he starts to open wells that his father had originally dug. And then the shepherds said, oh, those are ours. So then Isaac would move to another well, open it up, and the shepherds would say, that's ours too. This happened 3 different times, and every time Isaac did not fight them, he just moved. So what he is doing, if you follow the geography, is he is getting pushed back into the land of Canaan where he's supposed to live in the first place. Okay? So that's where he moves back to. And then God appears to Isaac in a dream and says, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. God is reiterating this covenant promise to him. Then the Philistine king travels out to where Isaac is living and says, I think it would be best if we formed a treaty. Let's form a treaty of protection. And he says, I can see that the Lord is clearly with you. The Lord is clearly blessing you. Let's go ahead and make a treaty so you won't fight me and I won't fight you. That's Genesis 26. That is the story that interrupts the stealing of the birthright before we get to the stealing of the blessing. This is the bracketed story of Genesis 26 in the middle of what happens next between Jacob and Esau. So why is this story here? It's out of chronological order. It's an interruption in the narrative. What is it doing here? So here's my best guess. It shows us that Jacob, the grabber, is from a long line of deceivers and grabbers. They are not perfect people. Abraham pretended his wife was his sister too. So did Isaac. That's a possibility. God is still determined to bless them. You see God showing up twice in Genesis 26 to tell Isaac his plan to offer blessing. God promised to make Abraham's descendants a blessing to all peoples of the earth. And Abraham's descendants keep trying to manage this blessing. So they keep trying to protect themselves and to help God along when it seems impossible or it seems like the blessing is too long in coming. Okay, Genesis 27, and I'm going to hit this really quickly. Jacob stole Esau's blessing. If you grew up in Sunday school, you know this story. Esau has married 2 Canaanite women, and Rebekah's not happy about it. They were a source of grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac decided he was an old man and he didn't know when he was going to die, and so he decides that he's going to offer a blessing to Esau. Now, in this culture, what you were supposed to do at this moment is gather up all of your children and offer a blessing to all of them. Isaac did not do this. He hand-selected Esau and said, I'm going to bless you. Go out in the field, out into the wilds of Canaan, and get me some wild game, and then I will offer you this blessing. Rebecca hears about it, and she thinks, that's not how this is supposed to work. And so she says to Jacob, dress up like your brother, put on his clothes, we'll put goat skin on your arm so your dad is fooled, and I'll make some food that tastes like the food your brother makes, and you will get the blessing. Now, I have heard this story told as Rebecca is so conniving and wrong and manipulative, and she's adjusting the situation to serve her own purposes. And that may be true. But I want to caution us to remember, she was told that the older would serve the younger. So, is she trying to accomplish God's purposes, maybe not in the healthiest ways? Or is she manipulating things to serve her favored son? Again, I don't have the answers. I'm just asking the questions. We're told that this all works to fool Isaac. He believes he's blessing Esau when in fact he's blessing Jacob. So at the end of this story, Jacob has both the birthright and the blessing, and Esau effectively has nothing. And so Esau is determined to kill his brother as soon as his father dies. And so Rebecca says, I'm going to lose both my husband and my favorite son on the same day. I'm not okay with that. And so she goes to her husband and says, I'm tired of these Canaanite women that Esau's married to. I don't want Jacob to marry a Canaanite woman as well. Send him off to my brother's family in Haran. That's Laban from last week. And let him get a wife from my own family. So that's what happens. So we have Isaac ignoring the custom of blessing all of his children and only wanting to bless Esau. We have Rebecca making sure that Jacob gets the blessing instead. We don't know if that's good or bad. And in the end, Jacob is cheating his way into the birthright and blessing which God had already promised to give him. Was this how God intended to bless Jacob? There's also, and this is what I'm going to leave you with, there's no evidence that Jacob actually ever made good on these things, because Jacob's wealth grew from a completely different part of the world, back in Haran. He doesn't seem to ever claim the birthright or the blessing that he tricked his way into getting. Okay, so here are my questions. That's a lot of information, guys, I know. I went really fast. But here are the questions I want you to consider around your tables. Why do you think the story of Isaac and Rebekah and the Philistine kingdom interrupted the story of Jacob and Esau? Normally, when there's an interruption in the narrative, it's there for a reason, and it's supposed to serve as an interpretive key for the narrative that we're reading. So why is this story there? And then second, how should we respond to these biblical characters who sometimes act like villains and sometimes act like saints? Big questions. Go ahead and discuss them around your table, and then I'll wrap us up. I'm hoping that afterwards some of you will find me and tell me the answers, because I really want to know. I felt like, can I preach it this way? Because I don't feel resolved about these things, but I think there's something actually helpful about hearing, like, I don't know the resolution to these things. These people are both good and bad. They're not perfect heroes as much as we might want them to be. But the real hero of this story is God. God can be trusted. God's methods are different than our own, and sometimes they're unexpected. With this prediction that God gave Rebekah, I just think she wasn't looking for that. She just wanted to make sure she wasn't going to die in childbirth. And God gave her a lot more. And God also seems intent on turning our earthly expectations upside down. So if you've studied the book of Genesis, you know that God has this habit. The culture says primogeniture, the oldest child gets everything. You know, they get the birthright, they get the blessing, and everybody else just gets a portion. And God regularly turns that on its head, to the point where it's almost ridiculous. And you see that throughout Scripture. When humans attempt to disrupt, delay, or derail God's blessings, there might be unfortunate consequences. One of the unfortunate consequences of this is that Jacob may well have never seen his mother again in his life. She died before he came home, which is an unfortunate consequence. But God will not be deterred from achieving God's purposes. Jacob and Esau had a major rift in their relationship, but this is not the end of the story. Pastor Melissa's preaching next week. She'll give us a little more detail on what comes next. But again, there's no evidence that Jacob actually received the benefits of the birthright or the blessing. And then finally, I just want to leave you with this tidbit that Moses is the one telling these stories to the people of Israel as they are building their own cultural identity. And that's the piece I think that's worth thinking about. Why is Moses telling these stories in this way? And Jacob is the father of the Israelites. So part of their takeaway is our ancestor was a mix of good and bad. And this is part of their origin story. But also they're hearing, again, the repetition of the blessing of God, the determination of God to bless this family through this line in these specific ways. So that's what I have for us this morning.